All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of archaeology's most, electrifying mysteries. And I mean that literally. We're talking about a little clay pot that might just rewrite the history of technology as we know it. Or maybe not. Let's dig in and find out.
So get this. Could our ancient ancestors have actually discovered electricity 2,000 years before Volta? I mean, everything we learn in school says the first battery was invented in 1800. But what if that's wrong? What if a device just like it was humming away in ancient Mesopotamia? This one single artifact could throw that whole timeline right out of the window.
Okay, so to really get what all the fuss is about, you've got to meet the star of our show, this mysterious little object. And here it is. This is what's known as the Baghdad Battery. It was dug up back in 1936 in modern-day Iraq, not too far from the ancient capital of Ctesiphon. And archaeologists have dated it to somewhere between 150 BCE and 650 AD. So yeah, we're talking about something that's roughly 2,000 years old.
You know, when you look at how it's made, it's actually super simple. It's just this little clay pot, maybe 6 inches tall. You peek inside and there's a cylinder made of a rolled up sheet of copper. And then hanging right in the middle of that copper cylinder is an iron rod. The whole thing is sealed up at the top with a plug of bitumen, which is basically just asphalt. That's really it. Iron, copper, and a clay pot. So why is this little thing so special?
Yeah, on its own, it's just a kind of weird old jar. But then, in 1938, someone came up with a wild new theory that turned this thing from a museum curiosity into a global sensation.
And that someone was Wilhelm König. He was the director of the National Museum of Iraq at the time. He took one look at this weird combination of metals and came up with an explanation for it that was, pretty radical.
König's big idea was this. This isn't just a pot, it's a galvanic cell. A primitive battery. He figured if you poured some kind of acid in there, like vinegar or grape juice, the chemical reaction between the copper and the iron would actually create an electric current. And his main guess for what they used it for? Electroplating, fusing a super thin layer of gold onto silver objects.
Okay, an ancient battery. That's a huge claim, right? And you know what they say about huge claims? They need huge proof. So of course, people in the modern day just had to see if this could actually work.
Probably the most famous attempt came from the TV show Mythbusters. They built 10 exact replicas, handmade based on the original design. For their acid, their electrolyte, they went with lemon juice. Makes sense, something people would have had back then. And to really get some juice flowing, they hooked all 10 of their replica pots together in a series.
And what happened? Well, it actually worked. Hooked together, those 10 little pots produced a steady 4.33 volts of electricity. Now, that's not a ton of power, but it was, without a doubt, an electric current.
So they proved the basic idea was sound. The voltage was actually strong enough to electroplate a small metal token, just like König theorized. And get this, it could even create a little tingling sensation on your skin, which opens up this whole other idea of maybe some kind of ancient electrotherapy. For a hot minute there, the ancient battery theory was looking totally plausible.
But, and this is a big but, just because something could have worked doesn't mean it actually did. And this is the point where mainstream science and archaeology really start to push back. And they push back hard.
Yeah, even with those successful replicas, pretty much all archaeologists and historians are, let's just say, not convinced. In fact, they're deeply skeptical. Because when you stop looking at replicas and start looking closer at the actual artifact and the context it was found in, the whole battery theory starts to unravel.
So here's the case against it, and it's all about simple, practical problems. First off, no wires. Not a single wire or connector has ever been found with these things. How do you get the power out? Second, that asphalt seal on top, it's totally solid. So how would you refill the liquid acid once it ran out? It would be a huge pain. Plus, the copper cylinder inside wasn't even watertight. And maybe the most damning piece of evidence. They've tested the original artifact, and there's zero trace of any acidic electrolyte residue inside. Nothing. And the real nail in the coffin, all those electroplated objects from that time period, turns out they weren't electroplated at all. They were fire gilded, which is a totally different process using mercury that doesn't need electricity.
Okay, so if it's not a battery, then what in the world is it? Well, the most likely answer is something a lot more ordinary for the time, even if it's not quite as exciting.
Let's put the two main theories side by side. You've got the battery idea, which is super cool but seems totally out of place for its time and has no real supporting evidence. Then you have the other, much more accepted theory, that it was just a container for sacred scrolls. And that idea, it actually fits the historical context perfectly.
And here's why that theory holds up. Archaeologists have found very similar sealed jars at other sites nearby, like in the ancient city of Seleucia. And guess what was inside them? Not battery parts, but the leftover bits of what used to be rolled up papyrus or other plant fibers. So the thinking is, these jars were basically ancient waterproof safes used to protect important religious texts or maybe even magical spells from getting damaged.
Really, the expert consensus on this is pretty much universal. Dr. Elizabeth Stone, who's a top expert on Iraqi archaeology, said it best. I don't know anybody who thinks it's a real battery in the field. The evidence simply doesn't add up.
So, does that mean the Baghdad Battery is just a big disappointment? Absolutely not. Its real value isn't about generating volts, it's about what it teaches us about how we look at history.
You see, the Baghdad Battery is a perfect example of what people call an out-of-place artifact, something that just seems way too advanced for its time. It gets our imagination going, right? We start thinking about lost technologies and ancient geniuses. But it also shows us why the scientific method is so important. That careful, rigorous investigation, that hunt for actual context, it brings us from a really cool, spectacular story back down to a more likely and more grounded truth.
It's a great reminder that history isn't just a set of facts written in stone. It's always being discovered and reevaluated. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How many other historical mysteries out there are just waiting for us to take a second look? Thanks so much for joining us.